On March 25, 1945, an immense fleet of American warships closed on Okinawa, the largest pendant in the chain of Ryukyu Islands, which arcs gently toward Formosa from the Japanese homeland. The following day, hundreds of those ships began a final week of bombardment before invading the home of the once independent Okinawan dynasty. 3 days later, Admiral Koshiro Oikawa, Emperor Hirohito's advisor on naval affairs, had an audience with the nearsighted monarch in Tokyo, some 900 miles northeast. His Majesty, deeply concerned, was eager to ensure his military leaders were ignoring no opportunity. The meeting took place in the Imperial Palace, which lay in the center of Tokyo and at the heart of national beliefs. American pilots had been ordered to spare the serene grounds that occupied almost a square mile of the overcrowded city. Elsewhere, the bombing was less intense than in previous weeks, only because so much of the capital had already been leveled. Air raid sirens were again wailing when Oikawa was driven through the imperial gates, and distant Okinawa was being pounded by wave after wave of planes from the American Armada's carriers, in addition to its heavy guns. Waiting with members of his staff in a damp bomb shelter near the Imperial Library, the harried admiral tried to think how best to brief the emperor about current operations. Although Oikawa was the Imperial Navy's chief of staff as well as the emperor's advisor, he was less than well informed. Intense rivalry with the commanders of the combined fleet kept him at arm's length from the vital decisions about operations. Imperial advisors now had an impossible task in any case. The Pacific War could no more be stopped than won. No one could acknowledge that the end was in sight, because the only possible end was the oblivion toward which the country was marching in lockstep. The officers bowed deeply when the emperor appeared, then seated themselves at a conference table. Hollywood would not have cast His Majesty for the role. Even in his field marshal's uniform, the middle-aged guy with glasses, as a student of the period recently described the slight figure, looked more the shy academic than a belligerent empire's ceremonial leader. But Hirohito's people revered him as a direct descendant of the sun goddess, and Oikawa and his staff sat sideways in order to avert their gaze when they took their places at the table. Few Japanese permitted themselves a direct glance at the divine presence, let alone an opinion about his appearance. If Hirohito had had the power to stop the war now, he may have considered it, not because he felt it had been wrong from the start, but because it had taken such terrible turns. His Majesty hadn't always been the disapproving spectator of Japan's military adventures that the American occupation would pretend after the surrender. Never having seen anything shameful in the attack on Pearl Harbor, he relished victory even more than his cooks and his gardeners did, especially after the Pacific War began, as well as it did for Japan. Nor was he as powerless or innocent as his post-war defenders would claim. On the contrary, he often studied battle plans attentively, sometimes making proposals for stronger action or asking questions that were interpreted as suggestions for altering tactics. That was particularly relevant to thousands of sailors now, for his questions to Oikawa were about to doom them. The admiral's focus on preparations for Okinawa's defense was inescapable. If the enemy succeeded in landing troops there, the war would enter a stage of almost inconceivable menace. The island was a mere 350 miles from the southern tip of Kyushu, the southernmost of the 4 major Japanese home islands, and it was not an occupied territory, but a sliver of the motherland, at least as a color on the map. The Ryukyus were one of the 47 Japanese prefectures. The emperor also worried that if the forthcoming battle there were lost, the army and navy will lose the trust of the nation. Against those terrible threats, the need for what was called special measures was clear. The chief of staff informed the emperor about provisions for kamikaze operations, which had already begun against the American fleet carrying out the pre-invasion bombardment. The emperor urged him to leave nothing to be desired in executing those plans, with a hard struggle by all our forces, since they will decide the fate of our empire. But Oikawa's assurance that 2,000 planes were available for the suicide attacks troubled Hirohito. "Was that all?" he asked in his reedy voice. The admiral's hasty reply that the army would contribute an additional 1,500 aircraft did not satisfy. "But where is the navy?" His Majesty asked, his tone putting an edge to the question. "Are there no more ships, no surface forces?" That sealed the fate of the Imperial Navy's Yamato, the world's biggest and best battleship. Horror of loss of face would grip combined fleet headquarters when they learned of the Emperor's query about why nothing had been planned for the surface ships. The same need to save face in a war in defense of honor rather than of military advantage or territory would cause much of the terrible waste at Okinawa. To the destruction would now be added a squadron of the last remaining operational warships, which combined fleet headquarters quickly undertook to send there. A joyfully triumphant beginning made the war's current bleakness doubly difficult to accept. Few Japanese generals and fewer admirals had believed total victory could be won in a long struggle with America, but many had hoped swift, stinging blows would persuade Washington to permit Japan to pursue her interests in the Pacific rather than subject the American people to the hardships of war. The attack on Pearl Harbor that delivered the first one in December 1941 appeared successful beyond its proponents' wildest dreams. American brass, including the self-congratulating General Douglas MacArthur, had been almost unanimous in doubting that a nation inferior in every way their perceptions registered would contemplate risking such an utterly stupid and almost fantastic venture, which could only end in her own speedy destruction. "When the Japs come down here," an Associated Press correspondent allowed, conveying the pre-war self-assurance of the American garrison in the Philippines, "they will be playing in the big leagues for the first time in their lives." That was shortly before the brilliantly daring raid that Sunday morning of December 7th on the major U.S. naval base near Honolulu. Japanese planes killed and wounded 4,000 Americans while sinking or severely disabling 5 of the 8 battleships nestled in Battleship Row. It would later become common coinage that the tactical masterstroke at Pearl Harbor was a great strategic blunder, because it shook Americans from their pacifist isolationism. Hitler had invaded Poland 2 years earlier, and now occupied most of Europe and united them in hot resolve for vengeance. But at the time, virtually every American saw the almost instant destruction of so much of the Pacific Fleet as a national calamity rather than a Japanese mistake. The near panic it prompted revealed more about America's susceptibility to paranoia than about the actual military situation, which, however, was gloomy in the short run. The spectacular strikes and lightning landings that followed Pearl Harbor stunned Americans with disaster after disaster. In 3 months, Japan took vast areas of the Pacific by seizing island territories equivalent in size to half the United States. Her conquests soon extended to a near circle with a diameter of 2,800 miles, from Manchuria to China to Burma to the Dutch East Indies to New Guinea to 500 miles west of Hawaii to the Bering Sea. Americans were particularly shocked by the fall of the Philippines despite her venerable U.S. garrison. The citadel of Corregidor, its fortifications protected by prodigious concrete, had been thought unconquerable. But nothing stopped the enduring, thirsting Japanese. Their men were tougher and better trained. Many of their weapons were superior. The supposedly backward Orientals had better binoculars, rangefinders and illumination devices, faster planes and much more effective torpedoes. Their crack ships, relentlessly drilled under the most demanding conditions, were unequaled in seamanship and firepower. Their carrier pilots were the world's best, but the loss of great numbers of those pilots at the crucial Battle of Midway in June 1942 began turning the tide. Midway told virtually every Japanese admiral that the huge gamble of hard punches to persuade America to negotiate rather than fight was lost, for the Pearl Harbor strike had prompted a psychological effect opposite to the one intended. Instead of discouraging a people softened by democracy and luxury from shouldering the burdens of all-out war, it jolted the world's greatest economic power, whose industrial capacity was roughly 10 times greater than Japan's, into unprecedented industrial and military action. Little could have better kindled righteous American wrath than the shock of the sneak attack, as generations would know it. However, the Midway victory brought little relief to the Americans fighting in the Pacific, for whom the next 33 months might have been 3 decades. A succession of struggles, each more fierce than the last, was required to retake Japanese captured territory. The Solomon Islands, Gilbert Islands, Mariana Islands, Bonin Islands. The names evoke images of supremely ferocious combat in atrocious conditions. Guadalcanal, Bougainville, Tarawa, Kwajalein, Peleliu, Guam, Tinian, Saipan. Not every island and atoll was host to progressively greater savagery, but the trend was clear. The nearer the site to the sacred Japanese homeland, the greater the resistance and blood. The first 6 days of fighting on Iwo Jima, about 700 miles south of Tokyo Bay, produced 10 times the expected number of casualties. The total reached nearly 26,000 Americans, most in their teens and early 20s, before some 250 Japanese launched a final suicide attack on the same March 26, 1945, when the American warships began their final pre-invasion bombardment of Okinawa. It was time as it had been for at least 2 savage years for Tokyo to plan capitulation. But no matter how clear that was to Allied observers, the realization and logic were apparent to few Japanese. Their defense of honor, more important than the defense of any military position, could not be abandoned until many more could die suitably. Admission of defeat was so inconceivable to the military commanders who ruled the country that Admiral Oikawa wouldn't think of mentioning it to his emperor that March 29, although the clearly futile defense of Okinawa the two discussed would almost inevitably be far costlier than all previous island bloodbaths. American troops headed there rhymed the Golden Gate in 48, meaning they feared Japan's full defeat and their homecoming might take 3 more years. Although Okinawa would be the beginning of the end, the lost war was far from over for Japan, and thus for the Allies. Yamato wasn't merely the mightiest engine of destruction afloat, as the U.S. Naval Institute would call her. The masterpiece of naval design and construction was also a symbol and a legend, a source of immense pride for the Japanese people. Her supremely graceful profile belied her size. Even the most recently commissioned American battle wagons of the Iowa class looked bulky by comparison. A sweeping foredeck made Yamato a marine greyhound, eager to leap upon the enemy, and able to, thanks to an innovative hull shape that helped boost her speed well above what was expected from a ship of her size and firepower. 12 engine and boiler rooms discharged their exhaust through a single funnel that swept back at a rakish 25-degree angle. With her teak weatherdeck unbroken from streamlined stem to stern, a distance almost the length of 3 football fields, she was a singularly elegant structure, and the crew's quarters on Hotel Yamato, as lesser ships' envious sailors nicknamed her, were positively indulgent by Japanese standards. She even had revolutionary air conditioning in many compartments, an extraordinary luxury in a navy that valued difficult conditions for their nourishment of the commitment to self-sacrifice inherent in Yamato Damashi, the Japanese fighting spirit. More to the point, she was not only one of the most intelligent and efficient capital ships ever built, but also the most powerful and most heavily armored, fully 40% larger than the 4 ships of the same Great Jawa class. With main armor of 16 inches and protection of vital parts such as magazines by belts up to 2 feet thick, she was built to withstand the heaviest American naval shells and 1,000-pound bombs dropped from 11,000 feet. Her own main armament consisted of 9 18.1-inch guns, compared to 16 inches on the Jawa-class wagons. They fired shells of 3,220 pounds, 30% heavier than America's new 16 inches, a distance of nearly 30 miles, which meant the ship could hit the most powerful enemy vessels well before they could try to close within their range of her. Since heavier guns virtually guaranteed victory in surface battles with lesser ships, peerless Yamato seemed certain to destroy the best American battleship, even small groups of them, if she encountered them without carriers. Her armor and ingenious damage control dispositions throughout her 5 decks made her nearly unbeatable and unsinkable by most surface opposition. It said much about national priorities that such a superb vessel, with her enormous consumption of resources, had been built at a time when the majority of Japanese panted to feed themselves. Only fierce ambition, matching sacrifice, and impassioned science permitted such a colossal construction project of such advanced conception, with dozens of major design and engineering triumphs and hundreds of components on the leading edge of naval technology, to be launched on such a relatively thin industrial base. Yamato's keel had been laid in 1937, when Japanese military spending consumed 70% of government expenditure. The dry dock was heavily screened by bamboo matting to keep her existence secret. She and a sister ship called Musashi, begun a year later, were to be the ace in the hole in a war with America, which, the Imperial Navy believed, wouldn't build battleships too large to use the Panama Canal. American bombs had sunk Musashi in October 1944, 5 months before the Emperor's fatal questions to Admiral Oikawa. The following month, American torpedoes sank giant Shinano, laid down in 1939 and later recommissioned as an aircraft carrier. The submarine that made that extraordinary kill had taken time off from her lifeguard patrol for downed B-29s because no air raids on the Japanese mainland were scheduled that night. 6 torpedoes hit the converted supercarrier as she was on her way in internal waters to the great naval port of Kure. But the first of her class was intact and fit. It didn't matter to most Japanese that was because she'd so far done little fighting. What everyone could see was that the Imperial Japanese Navy's only surviving operational battleship remained silvery and spotless. Yamato was its lucky ship, a survivor of the Battle of the Philippine Sea as well as Midway, and the only one to emerge from Leyte Gulf with only 2 insignificant bomb hits. It seemed even more natural that she remained magnificent even at that hopeless stage of the war, for she bore the national name. The Japanese often called themselves the Yamato people, after the ancient kingdom on the Yamato Plain on Honshu, the largest mainland island. Thus the poetic, evocative synonym for Japan rang with symbolic significance, the very kind that sustained the Japanese people as the war turned toward disaster. The pride of the fleet was thought to have a special mission. Her narrower one that first week of April, the planned foray to Okinawa, was supremely hazardous, for despite Yamato's crushing power, she was on her way toward obsolescence the moment she was quietly commissioned, several days after Pearl Harbor, which ironically ended the battleship's reign as the king of naval power. The attack's triumph forever laid to rest the notion that surface ships would fight it out for control of the Pacific, with victory going to the behemoths with the biggest guns and toughest armor. One of the old campaigners who best knew that was the Japanese Nelson, who'd planned the tactically and technically masterful Pearl Harbor strike. Isoroku Yamamoto was also called the Reluctant Admiral, because he'd long opposed war against the United States. "Do not uncover the teapot and release a typhoon," he warned when a staff officer first suggested the attack on Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto also vigorously opposed the building of the super battleships. Asked how aircraft could possibly sink the new Titans with their prodigious anti-aircraft armament, he replied prophetically that the fiercest serpent can be overcome by a swarm of ants, just as the Pacific War would repeatedly confirm. As much as Yamato's officers loved her, numerous sinkings of great capital ships by planes since 1941 led some to classify the vessel with the Great Wall of China and the Pyramids as the world's 3 great follies, prize examples of uselessness. Japanese admirals knew the new dominance of air power better than anyone. One of the most prominent was Minister of the Navy Mitsumasa Yonai, who was among the minority of senior admirals who had tried to avert war with America. Now Yonai regretted that the skeptics had allowed themselves to be convinced, against their better judgment, that quick, smashing defeats would persuade comfort-loving Americans not to make the sacrifices required for a lengthy struggle. The minister had become so appalled by the course of the war and his own complicity in extending it to America that he, a former prime minister, was holding secret talks, in fear for his life, with a few like-minded officers who hoped against hope to find a way to end hostilities. Yonai was now less concerned with the debate over plans for Yamato than with trying to replace the present prime minister with someone who would permit a more open pursuit of peace. He felt obliged to work for the survival of Japan herself, not the fate of just one battleship or even of a fleet. Still, he leaned against Yamato's mission to Okinawa because it would be useless, even harmful, to the existence of the country as a whole. The Navy's senior staff cleaved into factions. Many knew as well as Yonai that the war was lost, but were afraid to say so. Others yearned for immediate action no matter what the odds or consequences. Better that the remnants of the fleet make a glorious final charge than they be sunk at their moorings by carrier-based American planes now hitting homeland bases, with the insufferable humiliation to naval and national self-respect. Although the proportion of mystical firebrands was distinctly smaller than in the army, they used the same kinds of emotional appeal to honor and glory, to the Japanese spirit, and to obligations to the emperor. Even if the odds were only 10% in favor, the effort would be worthwhile, argued Captain Shigenori Kami, the combined fleet's chief of operations. A true samurai doesn't ask whether his efforts pay. He merely seeks the opportunity to sacrifice himself. Much lower in the command chain, the skipper of Yahagi, a light cruiser that would anchor Yamato's screen, disagreed. Captain Tameichi Hara, one of the distinguished fighting officers who went against the grain of that Japanese appeal for sacrifice and more sacrifice, pointedly told his men that they should not hesitate to return alive. "Our mission appears suicidal, and it is," Hara addressed his crew, "but I wish to emphasize that suicide is not the objective. You are not to be slain merely as sacrifices for the nation." That opinion had to be ventured said a good deal about the grip on the country by those who preached the value of precisely such sacrifices. "If the ship should be damaged or sunk, don't hesitate to save yourself," went Hara's key order, which he himself would follow in a rare reversal of the canon that Japanese commanding officers must go down with their ships. Other skippers argued that the overriding consideration was the simple duty to fight. The Navy's commander-in-chief was swayed by one argument, then another. Of course, the Imperial Navy must not lose more face, but which alternative offered more certainty of that? This time, the combined fleet's staff did not ignore Naval Chief of Staff Oikawa. They interpreted the Emperor's questions to him as a reproach. It would have been impossible for the Navy not to carry out what His Majesty appeared to have suggested with characteristic Japanese indirectness, that surface ships must join the sacrifice of the kamikaze pilots. Even to admit to him the tiny number of fighting ships left would have been an intolerable loss of face. It would be an exaggeration to say that at this stage of the war, the entire Yamato nation was preparing to do what Yamato had been ordered to at Okinawa, or that the same obligation to make the ultimate sacrifice would be expected of the Japanese people as a whole when the home islands were invaded. But the parallels were strong. When nothing was left but a supreme gesture of sacrificial defiance against an overwhelming force, that gesture had to be made. As a senior officer on one of Yamato's escort ships remembered it, Hirohito's questions implied essentially this: others are dying. Kamikaze pilots are dying gloriously. Why are you doing nothing? You too should die. When reports of the Imperial briefing reached the combined fleet staff later the same day, the debate was resolved. Operation Tenichigo, Heaven No. 1, was assured, and Yamato was as good as sunk. The time has come. Kamikaze Yamato, be a truly divine wind. Yamato's executive officer. These days the entire nation shares the fate of having death on the doorstep. Ensign Mitsuru Yoshida of Yamato. Now came the first sextet of dive bombers from the Bennington under Lieutenant Sim Dr. Ed DeGarmo. The Dauntlesses came out of the clouds on radar and dove after the big battleship. The heavy bursts of flak were about 1,000 feet short and below the altitude of the oncoming planes. "In pairs!" DeGarmo screamed into his JV. "Let's get the big rascal!" Lawrence Cortese, Valor at Okinawa. Another circumstance helped explain the naval chief's urge to act, even at the certain cost of the Navy's last and finest jewel. The destruction of Japan's major cities distressed them even more than the enemy's imminent landing on Okinawa. Operating from new bases on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, those islands of the earlier bloodbaths, state-of-the-art American aircraft were virtually erasing urban targets. Night after night, the industrial centers and their civilian populations were being blasted by hundreds of B-29s loaded to their unprecedented limits with high explosive and incendiary bombs. The awe-inspiring superfortresses were commanded by Major General Curtis LeMay, father of the new strategy of saturation bombing. LeMay, who'd arrived from Europe in January to take over the 21st Bomber Command, promised to beat Japan back into the Dark Ages. The shift from precision bombing of strategic sites to the destruction of entire cities led a Yokohama observer to report that looting presented no problem after a raid because nothing was left but rubble. Tokyo's biggest turn had come 3 weeks before Oikawa's briefing of the Emperor, while American landing forces for Okinawa were en route on troopships or being assembled on staging islands. During the night of March 9th to 10, 334 warplanes incinerated the capital's central districts with 10 times the tonnage of the Luftwaffe bombs that had caused the Great Fire of London in September 1940. Tokyo's Great Fire Raid, as it became known in turn, roasted residents on the streets and in their homes as if entire city blocks had been shoveled into ovens. The horror in those congested 16 square miles of wood and bamboo was unequalled anywhere on the home islands. By the count of the charred corpses, even the forthcoming atomic devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki would be lesser events. Measured by numbers of torturous deaths or decibels of human pain, that tragedy would be exceeded only by what awaited the Okinawan people. That night's strong wind whipped the flames of American incendiary bombs into a wall of fire roiling hundreds of feet in the air. 250,000 buildings were consumed. Before daylight, nearly a fifth of Tokyo's industrial areas and 63% of its commercial districts had disappeared. The heat ignited hordes at a distance, people running from the flames as fast as they could burst into balls of fire. Others jumped into canals for salvation and were boiled alive there. It was probably the greatest one-night disaster, with the largest sum of suffering, endured by any city in world history. When senior naval personnel debated the pros and cons of Yamato's sortie 3 weeks later, the Navy Ministry's windows remained caked in black from the smoke, and volunteers were cremating the last piles of carbonized corpses. Kure, on the inland sea about 2/3 of the way from Tokyo to mainland Japan's southernmost city of Kagoshima, and about 20 miles from Hiroshima, had so far been spared major devastation, although it was home to Japan's largest naval base, including the yard where Yamato had been launched 3 years earlier. Kure's turn for destruction would come 6 weeks later, during the battle for Okinawa's Sugarloaf Hill. Meanwhile, its food rations were approaching the starvation level, and cadets at the Naval Academy on the tiny island of Ita facing the port were jokingly dubbed moles, because they were too busy digging caves and tunnels for refuge from the awaited bombing to learn much seamanship. Casualty statistics for the conventional and atomic bombings are more art than science, but although no single set of commonly accepted figures exists for those 3 cities, prudent averaging suggests the atomic bomb killed some 140,000 in Hiroshima, half within days, the other half from slower-acting burns and radiation. But the conventional bombs dropped on Tokyo that night of March 9th to 10 probably left about 197,000 dead and missing, scorched and boned and baked to death, in General LeMay's description. And his operations were far from their climax. In late May, when the fighting on Okinawa would reach its apogee, American planes would drop 3,200 tons of high explosives on Yokohama, the same on Osaka, and 4,000 more on Tokyo, consuming new districts in another sea of flames. While the enemy fleet's last pre-invasion salvos were pounding Okinawa, Yamato was awaiting routine repairs in Kure. Moored to an outer buoy, the great ship seemed to a 22-year-old ensign named Mitsuru Yoshida like a gigantic rock commanding all around her. Within hours of the American landing on Okinawa, some 600 miles south, the rock was ordered underway. A detailed chart of Okinawan waters on the chart table showed an arc representing the range of Yamato's big guns to the landing beaches. She didn't sail directly there, however, but to a safer anchorage behind an island some 15 miles from Hiroshima, while the plans for her sortie were made. Combined Fleet Headquarters' order to launch her unique operation came in Fleet Signal 607 to Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito, commander of Task Force 2, as the second fleet battle group to be led by Yamato had been designated. Ito, a graduate student at Yale in the late 1920s, had opposed the mission from the start, certain that it held no hope without air cover. Although Combined Fleet Headquarters had stopped communicating with its second fleet, perhaps out of embarrassment, it sent its chief of staff, Ito's classmate and close friend at the Naval Academy, to fly in to reassure him. Since no naval or military argument could accomplish that, the classmate used moral suasion. Task Force 2 was being requested to die gloriously, heralding the death of all Japanese who preferred that to surrender. Sooner or later it will come to a special suicide attack by the entire nation, the 100 million of us. Ito was asked to die admirably as a model for the 100 million. The admiral agreed, but not all his captains did when summoned to a conference. After sometimes heated hours of discussion, the commander of the single cruiser among Yamato's escorts told his crew they were participating in a suicide mission, pure and simple. But unlike those our air force is carrying out, ours hasn't got the slightest chance of destroying an important target. The admiral in command of the entire 9-ship screen, that light cruiser plus 8 destroyers, protested that without air protection, we'll needlessly sacrifice the lives of 5,000 sailors. I'd gladly die at this very moment if I thought my death would help save our honourable homeland, but the officers believe they can accomplish more if allowed to go out alone as raiders to attack American ships. I agree with them. This isn't even a kamikaze mission, the admiral in command of the squadron of the 8 destroyers would add several days later, since that implies the chance of chalking up a worthy target. But in the end, Task Force Commander Ito broke a long silence at the conference by reflecting that all were being given an appropriate opportunity to perform their highest duty. A samurai lives so that he is always prepared to die, he said. That unchallengeable declaration, although it skirted the salient question of whether that was the best time to die, ended the argument at the command level. Orders are orders, the captain observed. We must make the best of the situation. As for Yamato's officers, many were also aware, even while hoping otherwise, that the mission could only be a suicidal display of useless courage. Few knew precisely that there were 15 American fleet carriers in Okinawan waters, plus a dozen smaller escort carriers, and the help, if needed, of 5 more of the Royal Navy's best, which were operating nearby. But even a majority of the junior officers recognized the foray as an exercise in fantasy. With a casualty rate of over 90% among Naval Academy graduates, they accepted that little life remained for them too. It wasn't going to their deaths, but going pointlessly that disturbed some of them. They wanted to die in a battle that might inflict damage on the enemy. American air reconnaissance, they said in confidence among themselves, was too thorough for the ship to avoid being detected far before her surface guns were in range to fire a single shot. And once she was spotted, American air power was too overwhelming, just as American submarines had become too prevalent and efficient for her to escape destruction. Which country showed the world what airplanes could do by sinking the Prince of Wales? An ironic voice asked. And even if Yamato did manage to reach Okinawa, so many enemy battleships and heavy cruisers would be waiting for her that she'd have no hope against their combined might. Against that, the chief argument remained what it had been at higher levels: the duty, glory, and joy of dying for emperor and country. At least one officer said aloud that their deaths would find purpose by contributing to defeat rather than victory. How else can Japan be saved except by losing and coming to its senses? We'll die as harbingers of Japan's new life. That's where our real salvation lies, doesn't it? But the expedition's operational plan was of course rooted in quite different notions, even if it was uncharacteristically ambiguous for Japanese practice. Task Force 2's primary task was to serve as a decoy for weakening enemy defenses against a forthcoming mass kamikaze attack by luring away American carrier-based interceptors. The ships were to survive as long as possible and shoot down as many enemy planes as possible, after which any that managed to reach Okinawa were to charge a large enemy anchorage offshore at daybreak on April 8th. Yamato's huge guns would devastate enemy naval and shore targets, perhaps sinking enough transports and causing enough shock to force an American withdrawal from the island. Finally, the ship would beach herself and continue firing until all ammunition was expended, whereupon surviving crew members would disembark to fight on land. During the ceremonial drinking of sake the evening before the sailing, the ship seemed overwhelmed by the immensity of her mission and possible tragedy. The men performed their roles like actors trapped in a morality play. April 6th was a glorious spring day on the calm inland sea. His previous disapproval of the suicide sortie in the past, Tameichi Hara, the captain of the light cruiser, now felt, "This beautiful homeland is worthy of our sacrifices." All hands assembled on the foredeck for the executive officer's reading of a farewell message from the combined fleet's commander-in-chief. They again heard the task force identified as special, meaning essentially suicidal, and the attack described as unparalleled in its heroic bravery. An urging to exalt the glorious tradition of the Imperial Navy's surface forces was intended to uplift spirits, and did. When the executive officer read, "The fate of the Empire truly rests on this one action," all instantly recognized the echo of Admiral Heikichiro Togo's almost identical exhortation to obliterate the Russian fleet at Tsushima in 1905, which was indeed accomplished. That encouragement had been repeated often enough in the present war, including by Admiral Yamamoto to the attack planes about to take off for Pearl Harbor, to have become a cliché. But despite the almost pathetic note in evoking those glorious moments to a fleet steaming to certain annihilation, the celebrated words boosted spirits all the same. After all, stunning victories by naval forces had swung the balance for Japan in the past. Fight gloriously to the death and completely destroy the enemy fleet. Render this operation the turning point of the war. The crew bowed in the direction of the Emperor, sang the national anthem, and shouted, "Banzai," 3 times. The assistant radar officer, 22-year-old Ensign Mitsuru Yoshida, was deeply moved, although he had no illusions about victory. The incomparable vessel on course for her sacred mission seemed the very soul of eternal, exalted Japan. Eyes watered and spines tingled as if the entire nation, present and past, were a military band playing a send-off march. "Do a good job," officers encouraged. "Die a death worthy of you." Okinawa was 600 miles away. The Japanese public, when they finally learned of the mission's outcome, would long believe Yamato sailed with too little fuel for a round trip, especially after the seeming confirmation by the 2,000 tons of bunker oil noted in the official departure report. But young officers on the combined fleet staff could not leave the world's best ship with no chance to return. They knew the staggering odds as well as anyone. If the ship did have the inconceivably good luck to reach Okinawa undetected, she'd have a fighting chance against any 2, possibly even 3 or 4 American battleships and cruisers, but none against the dozen or more that would engage her, and that wasn't counting the enemy carriers and their planes, the critical factor in every major engagement at sea. Still, the junior officers rushed around Kure, frantically securing more precious fuel from overlooked storage places and ships not participating in the mission. Contrary to accounts by Japanese admirals and Western historians, Yamato's bunkers held more than enough to bring her back to her base. Now, steaming outward, Her Majesty continued making it emotionally unthinkable that she would do otherwise. "Thanks to her incomparable seaworthiness," Ensign Yoshida recorded about the first hours underway, "there is no pitch or roll. Even on the bridge we have the illusion of standing on firm ground." Yet the sea was deadly. With Yamato in the center and the cruiser Yahagi bringing up the rear, the force deployed in a formation for night sailing under threat of submarine attack. Although the Bungo Strait, which it entered from the inland sea, was part of what American submariners had dubbed the hit parade waters, that narrow passage had to be run because B-29s had just remined safer straits east and west. The beautiful spring day was ending in glorious twilight. Sailors gazed at early cherry blossoms, ancient symbol of Japanese purity and evanescence, modern symbol of suicide volunteers. Lovingly observing Kyushu a few miles to starboard and Shikoku a few miles to port, the crew tried not to think that this was their last sight of the home islands, and to forget that the enemy that controls the sky controls the sea. He also controlled the radio waves. During the previous week, an American cryptanalysis center in Pearl Harbor had been working hard on Secret Fleet Signal 607 and the accompanying flurry of intercepted radio messages. Intelligence analysts had put together an accurate summary of Task Group 2's composition and intentions, even before it set sail, and Yamato got no farther than the Bungo Strait before the first American sightings were made. In the late afternoon of April 6th, Hackleback and Threadfin, 2 submarines patrolling for the Japanese group, radioed an accurate description of it to Task Force 58, the American strike force at sea in the area. Trailing the formation by 5 miles, the submarines watched in fascination. The contact reports of American planes that took over the surveillance the following morning, a minute-by-minute record of the force's position, course and speed, were monitored by Yamato's radio personnel, but the captain could do nothing about them short of turning back. Hours after sailing, the great ship was doomed. The men who manned their watches on the bridge that night worked with quiet intensity, the highest-ranking officers distinguished by fluorescent initials on their caps. Just before midnight, Ensign Yoshida climbed a ladder to the bridge for lookout duty. Facing his home in Tokyo, he bowed and said a brief prayer. Task Force 58 was roughly 100 miles northeast of Okinawa when the submarine reports told it what it had been waiting to hear. A search plane from the carrier Essex found the Yamato group at dawn the following morning. From then on, it was relentlessly shadowed by aircraft flying just out of range of Japanese anti-aircraft armament, among them flying boats based at Kurama Reto, an island group 15 miles west of Okinawa that Americans had taken a few days before landing on Okinawa itself. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commander of the Fifth Fleet, had intended to give his battleships first crack at the Yamato as a kind of combat training. Adrenaline surged through the American crews when Spruance signaled them to prepare for a battle of behemoths that would surely be the war's last major surface action. But Task Force 58's Vice Admiral, Mark Mitcher, wanted to show that his planes could sink the world's most powerful ship, and Spruance yielded to his subordinate in direct command of the fighting unit. Mitcher ordered Task Force 58's 4 groups into launching positions. Reconnaissance planes from no less than a dozen carriers stalked Yamato while their strike craft were readied. In the unlikely event that those carriers and their escort of 8 battleships and a dozen heavy cruisers would be unable to deal with the vastly weaker enemy group, older ships from the flotilla bombarding Okinawa also made ready to engage, 6 battleships of the 10 in the shore bombardment force, 7 cruisers and 21 destroyers. 90 minutes after the sighting of Yamato from the air, the task groups began launching their strikes from near Okinawa. The first main attack of 280 planes included dive bombers with 1,000 and 500-pound bombs and torpedo bombers with the latest torpedoes. The flying boats, which had been shadowing the prey from a protecting overcast, guided them to their target, now just over halfway to Okinawa. On board Yamato, there was some relief that the force had come so far without damage, despite the enemy search planes that were known to be plotting its position minute by minute. At noon, in the open waters of the East China Sea, a smiling force commander expressed confidence that all had gone well on the morning watch, even though a radio report from a lookout on a Ryukyuan island north of Okinawa had announced that an estimated 250 enemy planes were headed in his direction. Half an hour later, a new radar contact was made, and a hoarse voice reported the approaching aircraft's direction and range. The warning was so similar to hundreds of shipboard drills that the crew found it hard to accept as real, but the tension quickly surged as lookouts strained to see the enemy. At last, 2 Grummons were spotted, then 5, then 30. Yamato's huge number of anti-aircraft guns had been bolstered by even more before she sailed. On Captain Ariga's order, 6 6-inch secondary batteries, 24 5-inch anti-aircraft, and 150 machine guns commenced firing at the same instant, joined by the escorting destroyer's main and secondary batteries. The roar was as terrible as the sight of so many hostile planes. No other Japanese force could come close to putting up so much flak, but although Yamato's main batteries had once shot down an entire 10-plane formation, the force now faced far too many planes piloted by men with too much talent. A bomb hit one of the destroyers almost immediately. She exposed her crimson underbelly, lifted her stern into the air, and sank in less than a minute, leaving a few dozen survivors. And despite the black curtain of shell bursts and shrapnel from Yamato, despite desperate evasive maneuvers with her 150,000 horsepower engines straining mightily at full throttle, 2 Curtiss Hell divers penetrated the curtain. In minutes, they hit the ship with 2 bombs near the aft tower, destroying one of her radar rooms. 4 minutes later, a torpedo bomber scored a hit on the port bow. A hot fragment killed a sailor near Ensign Yoshida. Through the deafening din of the explosions and anti-aircraft fire, he heard the dull thud of his skull striking against the bulkhead and sniffed fresh blood in the pall of smoke rising from the hits. After the first strike broke off, the Chief of Staff speculated that pilots of such fearless skill in bearing down to bomb and torpedo in the face of the ship's great anti-aircraft fire must be of the enemy elite. But during the ensuing lull, some sailors assured themselves they'd survived the worst, The enemy carriers had surely exhausted themselves. Knowing a single torpedo couldn't seriously damage the great ship, her officers tried to make light of the hit. As medical corpsmen removed the body of a sailor from the bridge, Captain Arriga comforted the others. "We're still afloat and still fighting," the famous veteran declared. The second wave, which arrived less than an hour after the first, had so many planes that a gunner likened the little spots under the clouds to sesame seeds. Bullets and shrapnel flew as thick as buckshot. 3 sailors toppled simultaneously on young Yoshida. A fellow ensign tried to rise and bandage his thigh with a blood-soaked towel. As he was placed on a stretcher, he turned pale, smiled slightly, and fell back dead. The smell of human fat heavy in the air, and the flocks of sailors blown apart by direct hits so that not even the stench of their deaths was left to float in the air, created a kind of phantasmagoria. One of the first 2 bombs destroyed the compartment that housed the scopes for the air search radar, a devastating loss. Yamato's anti-aircraft fire remained without parallel in the Japanese Navy. Her remarkable agility allowed her to dodge torpedoes as if she were a much smaller ship. She fired her 18-inch guns into the sea, presumably to down low-flying torpedo planes with the massive waterspouts. Still, the number of planes and their pilots' skill unnerved the Japanese gunners. No fewer than 5 torpedoes struck the port side during the second wave. The invulnerable ship began listing to port as more bombs rained on her, causing enormous casualties. Even the near misses inflicted heavy damage. Their waterspouts were so fierce that they threatened to shatter metal high on the bridge. In the almost continuous attacks from 1300 to 1417 hours, the sailors lost track of the waves. The third one, of over 100 planes, arrived on the heels of the second and scored several direct bomb hits near the stack and 2 more torpedo hits, again port amidships. Not even the least sinkable ship could take infinite damage. The 6 torpedo hits on the port side caused serious flooding, despite 1150 watertight compartments designed to prevent it. The list weakened morale and threatened fighting capability, which would be cut in half if it went to 5 degrees. Another ingenious engineering design allowed lists to be corrected by flooding the corresponding spaces on the opposite side. When the skipper ordered that measure, Ensign Yoshida immediately telephoned to warn the crews of the starboard boiler and engine rooms, but too late. Caught between the cold seawater rushing in and the steam of damaged boilers, several hundred men who until that moment had made the ship go, battling sweltering heat amid deafening noise, uncomplaining throughout, were atomized. Confined in the depths of the ship with no way of knowing how the battle is going, their bodies bathed in sweat and oil, they can converse and communicate only by hand signals. In the instant the water rushes in, the black gang on duty are dashed to pieces, turned into drops of spray. They see nothing and hear nothing. Shattered into lumps, they dissolve. At the price of those several hundred lives, the ship's trim was nearly restored, but her speed and maneuverability were much reduced. Low in the water and moving slowly, Yamato was an increasingly easy target. The fourth wave of over 150 planes landed at least 10 more bombs topside and gouged out more of the port side with new torpedo hits. Her steering gear disabled, the ship was almost out of control. Still, professional officers marveled at the flying skill that made the American planes so different from practice targets. Yoshida noticed the flushed faces of the pilots bearing down on him one after another, their eyes opened wide or squeezed tight. Coming in again and again on the ideal approach, precisely, exactly, calmly, they evoke in us a sense of exhilaration, virtuosi. Theirs is a strength we can't divine, a force we cannot fathom. At the same time, Japanese officers were surprised that no pilot, even among the few who were hit, thought to crash his plane into the ship, kamikaze style. The once peerless vessel was a nightmare of desolation. Everything topside was a jumble of jagged steel and chunks of human flesh seared to blackened lumps. Torrents of the crew's blood washed body parts along the slanting deck. The convergence of torpedoes flooded the supposedly impregnable communications department. The watertight radio room had taken so much water that the ship had to rely entirely on light bankers and flag signals to communicate with her screen. Without radio capability, The giant vessel seemed to be disintegrating into separate parts while she floated in the water, like a chunk of waterlogged wood. Hope you will bring back a nice fish for breakfast. Signal from the commander of the American landing forces to the commander of the gunfire and covering forces just before the sighting of Yamato. The rail's rivets are icy against my palms, but inside my body I feel a flush of warmth. Father, mother, older sister, late brother-in-law lost in action a year ago. They stand clearly before me, and the faces of acquaintances, teachers and friends pass before my mind's eye and face. Tam, grateful to you, I whisper repeatedly, instinctively. I have gained the road to an easy death. Death is easy. You not blessed with death, you who are still forced to live. How will you endure all the days after tomorrow? Mitsuru Yoshida, Requiem for Battleship Yamato. When the final attack began at 14 hours, the list was so great that it exposed the starboard side of the vulnerable belly. Severe damage to the rudder ended all evasive action, making the ship a nearly stationary target for more torpedoes. 70 degrees of list, an incredible 80 degrees. Most ships sink at half that angle. 2 years earlier, undergraduate Yoshida seemed destined to join Japan's elite from Tokyo Imperial University, its chief training ground. Now the ensign watched his unsinkable giant ship writhe in torment, an ideal target for bombs, nothing more. Overwhelmed by fatigue, the living kept to their duty amid the fearful desolation until they joined the corpses strewn about them. To the living, Captain Arriga, renowned for his bravery, shouted, "Hold on, men, hold on!" The encouragement of the burly, beloved gorilla, as he was nicknamed, did as much and as little as any display could. Since great Yamato's fate was certain, her amazing strength served only to prolong her agony. With the ship helpless and her anti-aircraft fire drastically reduced, the battle became a kind of exercise for the American planes. So many of the Fourth Wave's 386 were now circling above that they had to wait their turns for new runs, especially after rain squalls joined the low clouds to obscure the targets. Still, the enjoyment had its price. One Avenger's bombing run was so low that Yamato's final explosion set it afire. The pilot bailed out, and 2 PBM seaplanes that had been among the first to locate Task Force 2's position early that morning spotted his rubber raft. One served as a decoy for Japanese fire, while the other neatly landed to pluck the pilot from a seaweed of Japanese corpses and survivors. Those sailors and officers still able to see were dumbstruck by the American valor and pain to save an individual life. But now there were thousands more unsung Japanese heroes than American, including Admiral Seiichi Ito. From his prestigious place on doomed Yamato's bridge, the force commander who had helped devise the strategy of the war's every important naval battle silently watched the destruction and carnage he had foreseen when opposing the operation. Now he ordered it broken off and directed the surviving ships to return to port after rescuing the living from their disabled sisters. That order required great courage and resolve. Some senior officers in the group resented it bitterly, seeing cowardice in Ito's retreat from 100 million deaths rather than surrender. Perhaps his decision to abandon the operation at that final moment was an expression of, "I told you so." The Admiral shook hands with officers who crawled to him through the slanting deck's wreckage and pleaded to stay at his side. He issued a final order to save themselves and retired to his private quarters just under the bridge. His door did not open again. Captain Arriga ordered all hands on deck. Even as the few still alive below struggled out of hatches, water cascaded into the openings, drowning others. Smoke too thick for flags to be seen required that the remaining destroyers be signalled by lamp to come alongside for removal of Yamato's survivors. But the destroyers kept their distance, fearing the great hulk would suck them to the bottom together with herself. Many of the living on the battleship did not want rescue in any case. Some bound themselves together to lessen the possibility of floating or involuntarily struggling to the surface. A sailor who volunteered to stand guard at the battle flag earned an equally proud death by clinging unwaveringly to the staff as the flag dipped below the waves. When Captain Arriga suddenly remembered the portraits of the Emperor and Empress that had pride of place in the senior wardroom, he was assured they would not suffer the unspeakable disgrace of being captured after floating to the surface. The officer in charge of the sacred images was guarding them in his quarters, his hatch locked from the inside. Ariga had no more wish to leave the ship than did Admiral Ito. To ensure that he wouldn't, he had a messenger who tie him to the binnacle in the anti-aircraft command post atop the bridge. The captain cried, "Long live the Emperor!" then awaited the end, calmly eating biscuits, while a half-naked officer on deck stabbed the air with his sword and screamed, "Banzai!" at squads of enemy planes circling overhead, as if to symbolize the purpose of the mission and of continuing the war. After her 10 torpedo and 5 bomb hits and hundreds of near misses, the target with the list that now approached 90 degrees received the coup de grace from her own munitions. Before she capsized, shells stored in the magazines slipped from their positions and began knocking their fuses against bulkheads and overheads. Most of the 1,080 monsters for the main batteries, each 18.1 inches, hadn't been fired. They began detonating as the derelict rolled over and plunged toward her grave, thus ending 5 centuries of naval warfare based on competition between surface ships. The flash of light and 6,000-foot pillar of fire could be seen in Kagoshima, 200 miles distant. "The prettiest sight I've ever seen," noted a gunner in one of the American planes that had deftly disposed of the world's biggest and best battleship, just over 100 miles off the Kyushu coast. Although less passionate about offense over defense than the Imperial Army, the Navy favored speed and firepower over precaution and protection. For all Yamato's superb innovations, her medical facilities hadn't been designed to cope with heavy casualties. She carried no lifeboats or rafts. Those who managed not to be sucked down by the enormous weight of metal struggled in water heavy with oil, as thick as melted caramels, and, in many places, on fire. Some sang to keep up their courage. Hundreds choked and burned to death in the oil. Paradoxically, the enormous final explosion saved several dozen men by blowing them back to the surface from the hulk that was taking them to the bottom. Among the chosen providentially shot to the surface at the last instant before they drowned, Ensign Yoshida tried to help the wounded, but the explosion had been so great that he could find no debris large enough to make a raft. Yamato, support of my life, now gone, only bubbles, the strafing fire of machine guns, planes that skim past, hugging the water, carefree. The faces, the heads near me, jet black, monstrous, like balls of charcoal the size of cantaloupes. Teeth chattering, I groan with the cold. Several American planes made final strafing runs at the survivors struggling in the oil, some chanting the naval song that begins, "If I go away to sea, I'll return a brine-soaked corpse." It was one of the rare times when gallantry lay with the Japanese, whose pilots often murdered Americans descending in parachutes, but had refrained from shooting at the survivors of Repulse and Prince of Wales. One by one, those who had hung on until now began slipping under. The 3 surviving destroyers put boats over the side to salvage what they could of the human wreckage. The highest-ranking officer found alive, the admiral in command of the destroyer squadron, washed the oil from himself when pulled aboard, then wrote a signal to Combined Fleet Headquarters that he was headed for Okinawa. Operation Heaven No. 1 cost the American forces 12 flyers and 10 of their 386 planes, of which several, according to Yoshida, were lost when Yamato's final explosion engulfed them while they were circling to observe her end. It cost the Japanese 7 ships and 4,250 men, almost as many as the American Navy's entire losses of killed and missing in action would be at and around Okinawa, a toll itself far heavier than any previous naval campaign of the war. The attack on the light cruiser Yahagi, the largest of the screening ships, was second only to that on the main target. She took 12 bombs and 7 torpedoes before going down. Not one man on the destroyer Asashimo survived, although a bomb to the engine room of the destroyer Kasumi mortally wounded her. Half her crew transferred to Fuyutsuki, which bravely rushed alongside to save them. Fuyutsuki was one of 4 destroyers that escaped sinking. After they returned to their bases the following day, the crews were put in a kind of quarantine for several weeks in an attempt to keep the debacle of Task Force 2 from the public. The same reception awaited some of Yamato's crew who survived the last American strafing. It's often been written that the end of Yamato marked the end of the Imperial Japanese Navy, now but a glorious memory. Actually, a heavy cruiser and a destroyer would engage 5 Royal Navy destroyers the following month, and a submarine would sink the cruiser Indianapolis in July. Several other capital ships that remained intact would serve more as targets for American planes than as offensive threats. Except for aircraft and feeble anti-submarine efforts off the coasts of the home islands, the Navy would contribute nothing further of operational significance. Immobilized by lack of fuel, the handful of surviving capital ships rode at anchor under heavy camouflage near their bases, relegated to floating anti-aircraft batteries. In a final revenge for Pearl Harbor, as one historian called it, American planes sank them almost to the last, after which their officers and sailors prepared to join the defense of the home islands, although many knew it would be just as futile as the last spurt of glory on April 7th, after the loss of Okinawa. When the Emperor was informed of the destruction of Yamato and 5 of her escorts, he raised his hand to his temple and swayed in disbelief. "Gone?" he muttered. "She's gone?" When news reached Admiral Matome Ugaki, which was mounting most of the kamikaze attacks on the American fleet off Okinawa, he noted in his diary that battleships were still needed for the day when we resume the offensive, including a general offensive by the Japanese 32nd Army on Okinawa. When news reached General Mitsuru Ushijima, the commander of that 32nd Army, he snorted about the infernal waste and recalled that he had advised the Navy against the adventure. "Banzai charges should be left to soldiers," he said. When Japanese soldiers on Okinawa were informed by battleship Yamato destroyed leaflets dropped from American planes, they guffawed in disbelief. A photograph of the sinking ship prompted some to scoff at the absurd measures American propagandists were taking to try to demoralize them. They, the fighting men in the field, knew Yamato could never be sunk any more than the Yamato people could be defeated. Like the sailors in Operation Heaven No. 1, those troops on Okinawa would often be committed to actions that were useless for any rational military purpose. The percentage killed in action there would be only slightly smaller than on the Yamato mission, although the full Japanese design would consume 3 months rather than an hour and a quarter.